Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to use some data from a student experiment who is working on their thesis in order to try to help understand the type of data that's probably going to be a little bit more clinically useful, or what I think will be a little bit more clinically useful compared to how statistics are often run and reported. Now, I'm not an exceptionally sophisticated person with respect to truly understanding statistics. I think I do a decent job. I think I have strength in trying to figure out what the assumption of a statistical method might be if I can properly get enough information to get myself to a point where I can start to do that, because there are definitely assumptions in statistical methods, and if you don't know what those assumptions are, then it's hard to interpret them in a meaningful way or wield them. So the data set that I'm going to draw from is a student who is working on rib springing. So hands-on sternum of patient, and the patient inhales, and as a certain amount of pressure or a sensation of a certain amount of pressure hits that, the student will let off, and they'll do that twice. So it's a very, very short intervention. And what they're doing is they're taking inspiration and expiration measurements pre and post to see whether or not anything happens with respect to change. Now, the fundamental prediction would be that if you do rib springing, you should see improvement in inspiratory and expiratory volume. That's at least the assumption that the student's working with. Now, they also have a control group, so they have a pre-inspiration and expiration test. They have essentially a condition where nothing happens. So nothing happens to the person performing the control test. There is no intervention whatsoever. There's no sham, nothing. Just what happens if they are still for a certain period of time, which would be somewhat similar to the amount of time, or very similar to the amount of time that the person would be worked on with rib springing. And then it's a retest. So what happens in a fairly short period of time when nothing occurs versus when rib springing occurs. So what we would want to see is that the average, what we checked was whether or not the average change pre and post was different or was statistically significant. So you can do a t-test. Essentially, you have a group prior to intervention and a group after intervention below a certain size. Once you get above a certain size, t-tests don't seem to work as well. And what you're looking for is whether or not those groups are noticeably different, and the assumption carried there is that it is the intervention that did it, right? So sometimes what you're looking at is averages and magnitude. To describe how a t-test is properly run, I'm not going to be good at that, but what I can say is that you can run the t-test to figure out if the pre-measurement and the post-measurement are, as groups, are different than one another, such that if they're different than one another beyond a certain threshold, which is usually your 0.05 of confidence interval, your p of 0.05 or greater, right? So when you say greater, you would actually want to see 0.04 or 0.03 or 0.02 or 0.0000 whatever. That gives you a statistical analysis that suggests that whatever happened between the measurements generated the difference between the groups, and it generated whatever happened between the measurements generated the difference between the groups beyond random chance. So when you get past 0.05, the guess is, or the assumption built into that is that it is beyond random chance. So what I'll do is I'll share the information on the t-test for the control group and the experimental group, as well as then show you why those values may be less clinically useful than one would hope, right? So we have the t-test. So we have the control group. The t-test for inspiration, the value was 0.353440738. So lots of numbers. It's not greater than 0.05. It's not smaller than 0.05. So there is no statistically significant reading there beyond random chance. Now, there is differences with respect to inspiration with no intervention whatsoever. So I can share some of that. It's about 36% of the subjects, their inspiratory rate decreased. The percentage of control groups, so no intervention, where inspiration increased or inspiratory value increased, is 36% as well. And the percentage of no change is 28%. So with no intervention in a relatively short span of time, inspiratory measurements will go up, down, or do nothing. So there is random chance here. Now, what we get for inspiration after 2 rib springs is a p-value of 0.000000921485706. Sorry. I don't need to read that again. I made a mistake. But anyways, that says that the difference between the pre and the post is well beyond random chance, such that if we interpret it simply there, the acceptable interpretation is that rib springing was the thing that generated the difference pre and post. And it's generally a positive value with respect to what the amount of change was. So if you, let me actually look at this. I should be able to look at this. Now the measurement unit, I don't necessarily have off the top of my head, but if we look at the inspiratory average change, it's 179 of whatever the measurement is. I don't properly remember that, but it's 179 in the positive direction as an average. But let's see, the largest change was plus 500. But then also we had the value go in a negative direction. Looks like once. Am I going nuts? Yeah, that should be once. And it went negative 125, and then there was a value at which it didn't change at all. So we had 179 average change in the right direction, but we also had plus 500 change, and then we had a bunch that were lower than that, a bunch that had nothing, and one that went negative, right? So if we look at inspiration with rib springing and the rate at which it changed, okay, so what we do is we look at the number of, or the percentage of subjects who inspiration went in the negative direction. It's 4%. So that's actually a relatively good sign, because at least it's not going to make it go the wrong way. But what we then have is 64% of the time it goes the right way. It improves, or the value goes up as predicted or as desired. But there's 28% of the time when it does nothing. So at least with respect to rib springing and inspiratory volume, you get generally no change, or more often positive change. That's a reasonable sign. But if somebody is having a problem with inspiratory volume or inspiration and I do rib springing, I can't expect that it's going to work on everybody. I should expect that it's going to work at some rate. Now, 64% is probably not the proper rate for the entire population, but it's a rate that we can start with. We can see that there is going to be some rate at which inspiratory volume will increase because of rib springing, but there's also a rate at which it will do nothing. That will probably go up or down depending on how large of a sample we get, but eventually there will be essentially a regression to the mean, or a central tendency. So you'll have it kind of go to a middle-ish number. And that's, I wouldn't be surprised if it was around there, especially when we look at expiration. So if we look at expiration, we look at the control group. So we did absolutely nothing, or the student did absolutely nothing. Your t-test is 0.5589254317. So not better than random chance. Doing nothing does not make the groups different in a way that is better than random chance. So there is no intervention, so that's what we would want to see. We would want to see no statistical significance. When we look at the t-test for rib springing with expiration, it's not as statistically significant. You see 0.03333081137. So better than 0.05, so it is statistically significant, but it is not as significant as what happened with inspiration. So what do we see here? I'll go through the control group with respect to expiration. With the control group, expiration decreased about 60% of the time, increased about 40% of the time, and didn't change at all 0% of the time. So we've got 60-40. If you did that across enough people, you might get to 50-50, or it could stay 60-40. I don't know. And the student doesn't know because we had a limited amount of subjects, and this is the data we've collected so far. With respect to rib springing and expiration, the number or the percentage of subjects where we had a decrease in expiratory volume was 32%. We had 64% increase. So that 64% increase for inspiratory volume and expiratory volume is actually relatively stable within the groups, right? So we get a similar rate. And then we have 4% of patients where there was, or subjects where there was no change. So what we can say is that relatively similar rates, can we say that? At relatively similar rates, inspiratory volume and expiratory volume will improve with respect to rib springing, but at somewhat dissimilar rates, it will do nothing, right? Or it will, expiratory volume will go the wrong way more often. It'll go the wrong way about 32% of the time. So with respect to rib springing and expiratory volume, we get a signal whereby if you don't have enough information, which we don't have now, and you tried to increase expiratory volume, there's actually a rate at which it might go the direction you don't want it to go. And it's a little bit more important than with respect to inspiratory volume. So it seems to have more of a positive impact in the form of either no change or positive change than expiratory volume. So the reason I want to break it down with respect to how often we get the positive change, how often we get the negative change, and how often we get no change is because that information is more representative of the ability to make a clinical choice as to whether or not I think this thing is going to have the value that I want it to have. Another way to say that is this going to go the way I want it to go? With respect to medical ethics or healthcare ethics, primum non nocere, first do no harm, non-maleficence. Once you have a good reason to believe it will not do harm, so not do harm in the case of this data could be described by the categories no change or positive change. So it goes nowhere, it stays exactly the same, or it gets better. Once we get past that we have good reason to believe that there will be no harm, that the value will not go the direction we don't want it to go, then we can get to beneficence. We have good reason to believe it will do a good thing. Now, 64% of the time, having the inspiratory and expiratory volume increase probably doesn't hit the threshold. It probably is reasonable and more testing would be needed, but it's a good signal to say rib springing with respect to inspiratory and expiratory volume, maybe not other physiological markers, but with respect to the actual volume moving through the lungs. Now, keeping in mind that we didn't have sophisticated tools, the tools are fairly straightforward, and maybe if we had better tools to measure this, we could see different results. But if you don't see really good results on simple stuff, sometimes it's not necessarily valuable to go to more complicated stuff. But if we look at the rates at which we have a negatively valenced change, no change, or positive change, we get more valuable information with respect to non-maleficence and beneficence than if we looked at the t-test. So if we looked at the t-test and we saw statistical significance for improvement in inspiratory and expiratory volume across an entire group, then we would say, as clinicians, wow, well, it's statistically significant, I should go and rib spring anybody who's having a hard time breathing. And it would seem that that's not actually the case, and you'd only see that if you break it apart into another ontology or another set of categories in which things can be described of their own merit and compared. So inspiratory volume doesn't necessarily make, or rib springing with respect to inspiratory volume, you're going to see no change, negative change very little, positive change fairly often, no change at a sort of reasonable rate, 32-ish%. Maybe I read that wrong. I think it's 28%. Maybe I messed that up. But then what we see is, with respect to expiratory volume, we see more times where it goes negative. So I think, did that end up being 28%, or what did I do there? Some weird percentage. Anyways, we see expiratory volume going the negative direction. Yeah, negative direction 32% of the time. Something's got to be wrong there. Something's got to be funny with something I did here. I think I did something funny with the math, because I'm looking at this now as I'm describing it, and yeah, I did something a little bit funny with the math. I have to fix the math on this. So the percentages are going to change a little bit, but the phenomenon holds. The phenomenon holds whereby more often, so inspiratory volume, if you rib spring, it doesn't go the wrong way much. Expiratory volume, if you rib spring, it goes the wrong way more than one would hope. It has no change, very, very little, but it has positive change at a certain rate. Yeah, that's 64% of the time is right. That's right. It's something funny there. There's something funny with the math on the inspiratory with respect to, with specific respect to the percentage of subjects where there's no change. Something's funny there. I need to fix that math. I'm saying this out loud, so I'm thinking out loud while I'm recording this. The point, though, that I've already made is, if you see the t-test and it looks statistically significant, it can trick you into thinking that you have a net good when you actually want to look at the rates at which it goes the right way, the rates at which it does nothing, and the rates at which it goes the wrong way, because then you'll actually have a better understanding of what your intervention might do to the measurements that you're concerned about. And then you have to overlay your medical ethics or your healthcare ethics. Non-maleficence first. You should have good reason to believe it won't harm them. Then beneficence. You should have good reason to believe that it will do something positive. You have the value go in the direction you want. So if we're talking about how we are going to interpret experimentation or research with respect to hands-on manual practice, it may benefit our professions, osteopathy being my profession, massage therapy, physio, chiro, occupational therapy being the professions of others who may watch this. It's going to be valuable to try to figure out the rates at which things will go the right way, do nothing, or go the wrong way. So we can make a more informed ethical choice, but also a more informed, what the heck do they call it? There's a term that I criticize from time to time. Evidence-based medicine, evidence-based treatment. Because my claim is that that's simply the scientific method. So we should teach you the bedrock of the scientific method as opposed to teach you how to do EBM. If you're learning how to do EBM, then you're learning to do something a step away from bedrock. And it seems as though our professions are not the best at the fundamentals of the scientific method. So it would probably be better to focus on the scientific method, get good science happening, as well as more meaningful statistical analysis. Statistical analysis often is going to be aimed at aggregating data across groups so that you can start from a reasonable place. So your average numbers start you in a reasonable place, but then you have to recognize that the things that generated the average are different. They go the right direction, they go the wrong direction, or they do nothing. So it's going to be valuable to see that so that you can start to evaluate methodologies or treatment approaches in a way that give you good reason to believe that you're going to be able to get past non-maleficence and get into beneficence. Now, you may have other reasons to spring the rib cage that do not have to do with inspiratory or expiratory volume. Your reason may be that the person has limited motion within their thoracic region, and you can use, let's just say the posterior aspect of the thorax or the vertebral column is tender in the region. From time to time, you can use rib springing essentially as a broad method to mobilize the thoracic vertebral column because the ribs attach directly to the thoracic vertebral column. So you may have no reason to be thinking about inspiratory or expiratory volume. And based on what we see, you're probably not going to cause a problem with respiration or inspiratory or expiratory volume at a meaningful rate, at a negative rate. And I'm saying that with some trepidation because more information would probably be valuable based on at least what we see here. But you're not concerned about inspiratory and expiratory volume. You're concerned about the thoracic vertebral column, and mechanically speaking, and the thoracic vertebral column is tender, so you use the ribs to get to it. So rib springing there may actually be somewhat useful and beneficial, because if you were to work on the very tender thoracic vertebral column, you can't get past non-maleficence because you're going to generate negatively valent sensations in that person. So then you've got past non-maleficence, you've gone to rib springing for the T-spine, and now you're in beneficence because you think it's going to do something positive without doing something negative. So we have some things to consider there, at least in what my mind is processing at the moment with respect to the data. So we've got an example of data that, when broken apart in a different set of categories, aka gets better, does nothing, gets worse, that actually gives us some ability to possibly apply those methods that we're testing more in line with medical ethics. And we don't necessarily have to go through the rigmarole and the complication that I think I see in what people are attempting to say about evidence-based medicine and evidence-based practice. I think the evidence may exist, but the analysis may be wrong. I think people may be looking at the statistically significant analyses and not seeing the variance. I think the variance may be reasonable. So maybe the categorization system of gets better, does nothing, gets worse could be valuable statistically speaking, or maybe not statistically speaking, maybe with respect to non-maleficence and beneficence. So mixing statistics, medical ethics, and clinical practice. Thank you for listening this far. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll talk again soon.